Welcome to my full cast audio chapter presentation of Farthest Destiny, Book 2 in the Cycle of Fury, Chapter 1, Serial Exclusive, written, produced, and narrated by Alexander H. Snow. Under license of Sword in the Stone Productions, a joint venture between Excalibur and Half Peak Productions, featuring the voices of
Mitch Zander as Gunner and Bull's Ear,
Sharon as Julia,
Joshua Cookingham as Charlie,
Keely Smith, Karen.
Music and sounds featured include D&D Ambience, Siege with Monsters and Magic, Trebuchets, Creatures, Spells, by Michael Gelfi of RPG Audio, used with permission. Godsent, by Fairyland on Score to a New Beginning, released 2009, used under fair use. Return of the Hero by Sound Mopey, released under license of Legend Music on YouTube, released 2017, used under fair use. Monsters and Creatures Sounds Effects Library from Sound Ideas, freesoundeffect.net. Foreword. A special thanks to the following in R voice acting and all of the participants who gave me feedback and enthusiasm. Users include Lita Treyu, Crazy T, Revolutionary Bug 7588, Shedrick 3, and Garden and Hoe for the in-depth advice on how I could make sure this project got off the ground. Dad, I wish this was the entire story. Unfortunately, I've not been able to complete it, so I've decided to take the one part I feel is polished and ready to present. I also want to thank you again for instilling the many ideals and lessons of equality, fairness, love, understanding, knowledge, passion, commitment, logic, and countless others. Without them, I doubt I'd be able to call myself a human being. You are a font of information from history to music to pop culture, at least to the 1990s. Anyone who has not expressed appreciation for you is clearly an idiot and does not understand your value. And even as your son, I'm sure I don't fully comprehend that just yet. I love you. Your youngest, Alex. One. The King Returns. 7 years. Bells tolled, horns blared. 7 damned years. A commotion echoed through the castle as people rushed around. He left us. Yells rose through the windows from the streets. Julie made it to the armory, grabbing her leather armor and daggers. And now they're at the gate. Making her way out of the great hall of the castle, she searched for any signs of her friends. She was bumped and shoved with commotion. Seeing some soldiers standing around, she barked orders at them, some to the towers, some to the gates, others to follow her out of the courtyard into the city streets, overrun with lesser demon hordes. Scents of charred flesh, roaring fires, licking flames, ash on her tongue when she breathed, her eyes stinging with acrid smoke, all of her senses being assaulted. Her heart sank, and the feeling of a hard pit formed in her stomach. They weren't ready for this. Parliament had ignored her warnings for years, as if they didn't think it would happen, as if the reports from the corners of the kingdom didn't matter. They had their money, their commerce, and they had their magic back. That was his fault too. Julie ran, dodging crowds and equipment through the streets. Soldiers, guards, peasants fought for their lives. Both human and creature screams were heard from all directions, some victorious, some in pain, gleeful delight, fearful remorse. Broken families were yelling out for each other in the chaos while rummaging through rubble or amidst a death blow. Demon forces had swarmed the city at dusk, catching the inhabitants by surprise. The war had become quite complicated and painful. The unions made by the many races of the land had fallen apart. Friends became enemies. Enemies becoming friends, allies turning out to be double and triple agents. Dark cults had arisen, awakening long-forgotten magic. The elves had all but abandoned the humans to fight and protect their land. The dwarves retreated deep into the mountains to preserve themselves. Only the most adventurous would travel along the passes. Bandits controlled many major roads and worked for the dark cult leaders, or small kingdoms that were popping up, and they were aligning themselves with demonic hordes, either from fear or greed. Julie came rushing around a corner. There was a group of peasants huddled and crouching among a collapsed building, parts of it smoldering. A sign that had somehow managed to survive the assault read, "Mrs. Meadowlarks, Florist." There were 3 women around a group of 8 children. They were trying to shield them from a threat lumbering towards them. It was tall, grotesque. Chunks of yellow and rotted flesh swayed on fleshy strands from the giant, revealing its innards, and in some places, bones and tendons. Patches of scraggly hair adorned its head. The eye sockets were recessed, giving the appearance of bulging eyes that twitched and moved as if frantically searching. There was a series of tentacle-like arms jutting from its back. They dipped and raised on their own, blindly searching out prey. The creature wore leather armor that was half decayed. Patches of bronze, steel, and silk gleamed through, alluding to it being an ancient person of power and riches. The weapon it carried was a massive sword. It dragged it along the ground, tearing up the cobblestone and trenching the ground beneath. Without a second thought, she had drawn her daggers. She positioned herself between the group of peasants and the approaching creature. She bared her teeth and snarled at it. Unfazed, it continued to steady lumber towards them, growing angrier with the frustration of the city's impending loss and likely her own life. She threw a dagger straight at the creature's eyes. It flew straight and true. Slamming into an eye, the creature stopped, reaching up with its free hand. It fumbled for a moment or two and then pulled it out. As the blade came out, a gooey string of ocular fluid and black blood followed with it. The beast was quiet for another moment. It dropped the dagger. Another moment passed, and more explosions and screams filled the air. The creature shuddered. Fixating on Julie, it let loose a wet and slimy hissing scream. The tentacle-like appendages came to stand like snakes poised to strike. The beast raised its sword hand and swung. For being so large, it was nimble and focused, however inaccurate. The blade was high, but still caused Julie to lower her stance. The group behind her screamed. She was nearly caught off guard by one of the tentacle creatures striking at her with the swing's follow-through. She spun, using her dagger to deflect it, her blade glancing off of it. The creature had recovered its stance and chopped down, again missing. The sword crashed into the ground beside them, spewing chunks of broken stone and clumps of dirt in all directions. Julie shielded herself the best she could, holding her arms up, and the tentacles struck at her again, 3 of them in succession, the third one knocking her other dagger from her grasp. It went flying somewhere into the chaos of the battle raging around them. The creature pried the blade from the earth. It poised to strike again. Julie, without a weapon, felt a sudden urgency, a gnawing, heavy weight in her stomach. The beast would not miss again. She backed towards the group. She was trying to protect them with her arms spread wide, meant to be a shield. She stumbled. She turned back to look at the people.
I'm sorry,
she said, shaking her head. One of the women shook her head among her tears, trying to choke out that it was okay. She knew that Julie had tried. She clamored for Julie's hand in comfort and some hope that it really would help. She pulled her back up tight against the huddled group. The children screeched and the adults wailed, their arms wrapped around Julie, trying to keep her close, a failing attempt to give her comfort in the face of death. The creature let loose another screeching hiss. The noise of the battlefield left Julie's mind as destiny set its claws into her thoughts. Her life passed by in a frantic dance in her head. Every event played vividly for her, and then she focused on that one day, the day Gunnar left over 7 years ago, She remembers holding her friend at the docks as they buzzed around them with activity, shrouded only in plain clothes to avoid any unwanted attention. A bag of clothes, a sword, and a small sack of gold are all he had taken. They spoke about all the good things to be done. They had cried too, not just because he was leaving, but there was hope. Hope that things could return to the way they had been, alive and well. Even Corrine. He said he would be back soon, be back to help them, make them stronger, be back for them, his friends. But he wasn't. She hated him. She screamed a curse in her head. Everything she had done for him and the people, and he abandoned them all. And for what? Time slowed to a crawl. She looked around, watching people being cut down by demons, orcs, other creatures she didn't recognize. Her heart sank. She wanted to help them all. None of this was fair. Why was this happening? Why wasn't he here to protect his people? She looked into the distance of the fighting. Explosions and fire broke the skyline with destruction. She wondered if Charlie was still alive. Maybe he'll save them? She looked in another direction, but didn't see anything. She began to search any spot she could see, her eye movements becoming frantic. The screaming of the people snapped her back to reality. The giant chopped down straight over her and the group of people. She turned her head, closing her eyes, large streams of tears falling from them. She grasped the clamoring hands of the people. To hell with you, Gunner. The shadows played on her eyelids. Running footsteps over gravel. A blade whistling as it cut the air. Metal contacting on metal? Her eyes shot open, head snapping forward. The lamenting of the people had become confused whimpering and short gasps. The blade of the creature had stopped above them. Standing before them was the silhouette of a man who stopped it. One hand on a spear lodged in the ground, as a pike would have been, bore the weight of the giant's blade. The figure soared, and his other hand effortlessly fended off the tentacles, his blade even slicing clean through some. The firelight glinted off his skin, an odd green, shimmering geometric pattern in some spots. He turned his head to look back at Julie, and the people huddled behind her, and she couldn't believe her eyes. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. He spoke.
Get up and fight!
Gunner commanded. He shot his attention back to the creature, who was recovering from his confusion. He batted off another strike from the remaining tentacles, and arcing around to the giant's sword, slammed into it, snapping it where he struck, the broken part falling to the ground with a loud crash. Gunner leaped at the beast in a flurry of ashes and dust, effortlessly ascending the broken blade. Stunned and slow to respond, the creature stood there as he did. Reaching the handguard, Gunner leapt again, his blade slicing through its throat. It collapsed to the ground, reeking in black, rancid blood pouring from the gash. It lay lifeless on the stones. Gunner landed just as effortlessly as he ascended. He turned to Julie again. That's when she noticed his eyes. It was as if they were reptilian, but only for a fraction of a moment.
Take that spear and go!
He dashed off into the mayhem without missing a beat, his silhouette fading in the heat and flames. She quickly stood, brushing off whatever ash and dirt she could. Grabbing the spear firmly with one hand, she motioned the group to follow her. With immense haste, she began trying to make her way to a safe location with the family. From there, she would fight again. Gunner rushed along the streets, the soul of Mazeg the Redeemed coursing through his body. As he ran, he twisted, sliced, and parried through enemies, working his way towards the castle. A great shaking began under his feet. The ground began to separate and large cracks started to form. Skidding to a halt to avoid falling into a giant chasm, the shaking and rumbling intensified. He was only a few hundred meters from the castle. A loud creaking also joined the mix, and then the castle began to sag in the middle. It crumbled from the center out, falling into a hole. Gunner could do nothing but stare in disbelief. A castle that had stood for hundreds of years now disappeared as if it were sand. Creatures and allies alike stood and watched in amazement for moments, all confused. The collapsed debris began to bulge in the middle. Gunnar felt an electric buzz run through him. Something was coming. The voids in the rubble started to shine in a familiar, eerie green-orange. He grasped his blade tight and began running again. He had to get as close as he could. As the bulge grew, all of the creature's eyes started to glow, their bodies quivering and then going limp. "Faster," he said to himself. The bulge began to break, and the creatures began to snap to rigid poses, allies becoming aware, readying themselves. With a demonic roar, the bulge burst. Debris spread and catapulted everywhere, raining down on the battlefield. Gunnar had climbed up a collapsed wall. He firmly planted his feet, a shockwave rushing over him. Yelling a command in a foreign tongue, he thrust a palm to the sky. An enormous light scribed shapes and symbols in the air over the entire battlefield. The lines were in brilliant colors against the smoke-covered skies. Green, blue, red, even black appeared illuminated. Those who looked upon it had no idea what it was or where it came from. The falling debris were obliterated when it struck the image. With a massive, guttural roar, the monsters had risen from its crater. The other creatures had continued the onslaught again. They became filled with a fierce resolve now, a more vile and cruel, distinct purpose than before. The beast easily stood at half the height of the castle. It had tubercular-scaled black skin. Spikes and two massive horns adorned the crown of its head. Its shoulders had the same appearance. Each elbow had a spike extending from the outside. Its face, a mix between human and reptile, its teeth long, set outside the mouth. The hands and feet were similarly clawed. It carried no weapon and moved slow, standing like a humanoid creature. Gunnar let the magic seal dissipate.
Julie had successfully delivered the group of citizens to a temporary hold under royal guards and healers. She armed herself with a bow, quiver, arrows, staff, and new daggers.
Julie then began her search for Charlie. As she ran through the streets, she would help any soldiers struggling with their enemies. She ran across many trolls and orcs, some skeletons, and even kobolds had somehow gotten in on the action. There were other creatures she'd only encountered in stories: minotaur, lizard folk, bugbears. None of this made sense. All of these creatures were only fairy tales, stories made to scare and awe the children. Julie came upon a group of 3 soldiers trying to kill a minotaur. She jumped into the fray, tripping the minotaur in mid-charge. The soldiers wasted no time in jumping at the creature, shoving their blades into its neck. It let out a pained scream that faded out into an airy gurgle as it choked on its own blood. The 3 soldiers thanked her, and they rushed off in pursuit of another fight. She continued to run towards the castle. She approached a clearing. She noticed a ring of 5 creatures surrounding something. She pushed herself to sprint. Using the spear, she vaulted herself over them to the center. Drawing her bow and arrow as she landed, with feet planted firmly in a crouched stance, her ears back.
Julie!
Someone yelled. She looked back to see Charlie. Her heart beat hard with resolve, having found him alive, albeit he was cut and bruised from fighting. She smiled and then promptly returned focus to the creatures. It was her, Charlie, and a soldier. 3 on 5. And then the ground began to shake. They looked around frantically, and then the 3 of them noticed that the creatures had all turned and were staring off in the same direction, towards the castle. They turned in time to see it collapse into the crowded horizon of ruin. After a few moments, they saw a light emanating from where the castle was, and then an explosion. A moment later, a shockwave ripped through, spraying debris into them. They shielded themselves with their arms. More debris began raining down on them from above. A large chunk smashed into the ground beside the soldier, narrowly missing him. Colored lines began tracing through the air, creating an ethereal glow above them. The debris stopped falling on them. They were falling on the space above the design in the air. It was a magic shield. It was destroying the falling debris. The creatures attacked. A winged creature that looked like a combined bat and lizard dove in from above. Two horned creatures with vicious polearms charged the soldier. Two humanoids wore black robes with a red and black tabard with an upside-down star adorned on the front. They carried black maces and shields. The face shields had large black horns. One went after Julie, while the other went after Charlie. The two creatures who were rushing the soldier both thrust at him. He was able to knock one polearm away and avoid the other. One of the parried creatures lost balance. The soldier thrust his sword up through its neck into its head. It gurgled as blood flooded its lungs and it tried to scream. However, the other creature had been able to keep its footing. As it turned around to see its comrade being skewered, in return, impaling the soldier through the chest. The polearm cut through the soldier's armor like it wasn't even there. A shrill scream of pain escaped the man. The creature pushed, and the polearm slipped out of the other side of the soldier. As the other creature and the soldier collapsed to their knees, the remaining creature twisted the blade 90 degrees and yanked it back out. Blood and fleshy bits sprayed about. The soldier fell back to his side, his body pouring bright red blood upon the ground, his soul having already vacated. Simultaneously, as one of the robed creatures came at Julia, she let loose the arrow. It flew true to its aim, lodging itself in the eye socket of the creature. Screaming in pain, it dropped the shield and mace, clutching at its face, and ceased advancing. From above, the flying creature shrieked as it closed in, just mere feet from her. She knocked an arrow, bringing the bow up. As she was about to be in position, it collided violently with her. Knocking the bow from her grasp, the giant claws on the creature's wings slashed at her. The scaled tail lacerated her body as it whipped around. Julie screamed in fear and anger as the creature's teeth sank into her shoulder. She managed to draw a dagger and blindly swung and stabbed. Feeling the dagger catch on something, she grunted loudly and pulled hard as she felt something tear. The creature, stopping its assault and a painful shriek retreating. It tried to fly, but all it did was flap violently in circles on the ground, leaving a grayish-black blood trail. She had nearly severed a chiropteran wing. Charlie was fending off his opponent with difficulty. He was managing to avoid getting hit, but was gradually moving backward, slamming into Julia. Charlie looked back, thinking it was an enemy. As he did, the robed creature he was fighting managed to strike him in the thigh. Letting out a scream of pain and surprise, Charlie dropped to one knee. He cradled the damaged leg.
Charlie!
Julie cried.
I'm fine.
He cried back.
Keep your eye on the enemy.
She turned to see that the other robed creature had recovered enough to begin approaching them again, the arrow sticking out of its eye. Her shoulder burned with pain. The creature that had been fighting the soldier had taken up a stance to trap them as well. Charlie's opponent had moved to trap also. The odds were now 3-2, and it was getting worse, fast. Julie couldn't use an arm, one side soaked in blood. Charlie couldn't stand. Confident in their capture of prey, they began to sneer and snarl, almost laughing. They jabbed at their captives, taunting, teasing them. After a minute or so, they became serious, a few commanding grunts and speech in a language they never heard, demonic hissing. And the robed creature, with an arrow lodged in its face, was in command. It raised the mace up, an elbow high and rear, the stance of an executioner.
Your soul will serve me,
it said in a hoarse, broken voice. Julie couldn't believe it. Again, on death's doorstep. She knew Gunnar wouldn't save them this time. He was off fighting in another part of the city, too far to get here in the nick of time. She reached behind with her good arm, grabbing Charlie. His pulse was racing.
I love you.
She said.
I love you too.
He forced through the pain.
But we aren't gone yet. We will fight to the end.
The robed creature brought his mace down. Simultaneously, a flash of light cut through the mace, a figure landing in a kneeling position. The free hand on the ground to stabilize the stance. She stood. The armor was a bright, pearlescent white and gold sheen, gilded with bold lines of gold and thin accents of silver. A bright red symbol of a sword and a sun imprinted on the breastplate over the heart. And on her head, thick locks of yellow blonde hair held back by a deep green headband. She almost radiated light. The creatures looked in awe of the figure now here. She stood up, and as she did, her blade was quick. In a flash, she had made a slicing motion at the arrow-faced creature. Slowly, a cascade of blood began up her neck. Then the head slid off the shoulders. She turned to the creature with a polearm, pointing her sword at it, boiling black blood dripping off.
I am Karen, Gale of the Azata. I will purge your unnatural existence from this land.
Fear washed over the two remaining combatants. They turned their weapons on her instead, and without hesitation charged. The polearm arced through the air. It glanced off her blade. The mace followed close behind, aiming at her head. Karen brought the pommel up to meet it. The shield pushed forward, and she braced a hand against the flat of her blade as it met. The force pushed her back a few inches. The polearm came in again, jabbing at her midsection. She stepped back to avoid it. It was a clear miss. The mace arced down at her again. She dropped her blade, and then dodged the strike. As the mace went down past her side and the polearm retracted, she moved forward between the two. She grabbed them by the throats, and using the force and their lack of balance, slammed them together. They hissed and shrieked.
In the name of Iomade, burn in hell!
Karen cried. The creatures began twitching, writhing in pain, shrieking. Rays of light began piercing them from the inside out, their flesh burning away like paper as it turned to ash and floated skyward. Karen struggled to keep them in place as the spell ran its course. After a few moments, the bodies were gone. A scorch mark on the ground and weapons were the only evidence something had been there. She stooped, picked up her sword, and sheathed it. She smiled, looking at Julie and Charlie, mouths gaping in awe of what they had just seen happen. She gave a small, nervous wave, sweeping back some hair that had fallen forward.
Heyo,
She took a couple of steps toward them.
you must be Julia and Charles.
She held out her arm for a handshake. Julie slowly grabbed hold of it and shook it, never letting her gaze leave Karen's face,
Yes.
is all she could muster. Karen looked at Charlie.
Oh, let me get that for you.
She knelt and grabbed his hurt leg. Before he could protest, she mumbled something about Aomade, and her hands gave off a soft white glow. After a few moments, she stood.
You should be all set, sir.
She said with a happy, upbeat tone.
And you.
She grabbed Julie and turned her around, grabbing her injured shoulder.
Ow!
She cried angrily.
Hush, kitty.
She again mumbled something about Aomade, and the glowing commenced once more.
I am not Kitty.
She yelled, annoyed.
You are now.
Karen giggled, patting her quickly on the head. Charlie laughed. Julie turned around, and without realizing it, she used her repaired arm to draw her other dagger. Raising it as if to stab Karen, she stopped. She looked up and saw that her arm was in perfect working order, aside from the torn clothing and dry blood. It hadn't felt this good in almost 10 years,
You're welcome.
Karen said with a wink.
Come, we must help your king.
She started in the direction of the collapsed castle. A giant creature could be seen, causing massive destruction around its location. As they started after her, Charlie couldn't help but ask,
Who are you?
I am Gunner's plan B. Should he fail, I will finish it.
Plan B?
Charlie prodded further.
Yes, plan B. Now hurry up.
She began to run towards the beast. Gunner made his way to the beast. Covered in dried black blood, he stood 30 meters from the giant creature. There was no doubt that this towering abomination was a pit fiend, a general of the hells. There were no minions nearby. The entire area was devoid of anything but rubble, the fiend, and Gunner. This particular fiend was enormous, at about 50 feet tall and a matching wingspan. Although for some reason it didn't appear to want to fly, it was content lumbering around and demolishing things around it, giving out loud orders and abyssal that echoed over the battlefield. Gunner sighed. He began walking up to the beast. Something still felt off about it. He noticed an odd, reddish-black mark on its chest, almost like a scar. The fiend took notice of Gunner's approach. It balled its massive hand into a fist, driving it down at him with a roar. Gunner stood his ground. The speed of the punch created a pressure effect. It was a split second before the wind caught up. It dispersed the dust and debris from the spot in a radius of some 20 feet. It was so clear you could see the cobblestone clearly and the radial cracks from the impact. The fiend pulled back his fist. Gunnar stood fast. A smaller version of his magical shield dissipated in a flicker. The fiend became puzzled. Gunnar locked his gaze on the fiend, drawing his sword.
What are you called?
He yelled up to it.
I am Balzir.
The fiend replied.
Who are you that survived that blow?
A deep sense of suspicion permeated its words. Gunnar glanced down to the side. He sensed his friends were coming, but still off away. A sly grin forming on his mouth. Gunnar turned back to the pit fiend. A soft green color began sweeping over his exposed skin, a familiar, geometric pattern shimmering randomly across it, and reptilian eyes overtaking his own. A low thud. The round gem on his breastplate glowed ever so faintly. The thud corresponded to an outward pressure wave emanating from the gem. Gunnar readied his sword.
I am the king of this land. My name is Gunnar. I possess the soul of Nezeg the Redeemed. We are one, and you will tell me why you are here, and then you will die.
The pit fiend processed this for a moment, letting out a deep and entertained laugh.
Nezeg?
He said, astonished.
The traitorous Newt was alive all this time?
Until I killed him. Now tell me what you're doing here.
Gunnar yelled in retort.
I doubt you killed him.
Balzir sneered.
But he was also weak, and you humans have grown stronger over the eons. But no matter, you will be the one dying, never knowing our plans!
The pit fiend let loose a blast of orange and green fire breath aimed at Gunnar. He didn't have time to summon a shield. Rolling to one side, he dodged the bulk of the blast. Coming out of the roll, smoke lofting from his figure, he charged Balzir. Balzir grabbed at Gunnar, hoping to capture his enemy and end the fight quickly. He missed. Gunnar zigged and zagged on his approach, his speed higher than any human Balzir had seen or heard of before. Could it be? He thought. That moment of hesitation was all Gunnar needed. Like the giant from before, he leaped at his target, and like before, an easy ascent. As he reached his apex at the spot on Balzir's chest, he poised himself for an overhead, two-handed stab. Balzir's hands closed hard behind him instinctively, driving Gunnar into his chest. An eerie stillness settled in the air. Balzir slowly rolled his hands away from his chest.
What?
He stared at the sight. The pesky human sword was hilt deep in his chest.
How did you?
We aren't done yet!
Yelled a voice from above. Balzir looked up in surprise.
Huh? No!
He bellowed.
Why are you here? Why are Azada on this plane?
Karen dropped down, her divine blade sinking to the hilt and the fiend's head. The beast's eyes went blank. Gunnar dropped to the ground, landing softly with a momentary pause just above the ground. Karen did the same. The pit fiend's body started to twitch as rays of light began emanating from inside its body. It began to burn away like the creatures before. Looking around the battlefield, a similar show occurred as Hell's minions evaporated. Julie and Charlie rounded an opening in the pile of rubble around where the fight had occurred. Out of breath, they came to a stop. Julie bent over, supporting herself on her knees, heaving for air. Charlie braced himself on part of the crumbled wall.
We're here!
Julie shouted between breaths, at one point even holding up a finger, indicating for them to wait. She looked up as Gunnar and Karen turned around. She missed the color of Gunnar's skin returning to its slightly tanned normalcy. Charlie and Julie, upon sufficient recovery, both began making their way towards Gunnar and Karen. Julie had some lift in her strides as she began to quicken her pace to her long-lost friend, a big, stupid smile growing on it. Charlie smiled too, perhaps not as big, but he was glad Gunnar was back. Gunnar chuckled as his friend bounded and slammed into him with a hug.
Hello, my friend,
He said. He, too, had a broad smile. She stepped back, grabbing his face between her hands.
Let me look at you!
She cried. She gently turned his head, looking him over like a doting mother. Dirty, no scratches, smelled of musky darkness and war, dry blood. Other than that, he appeared fine. She stared into his eyes, though. Something had changed in him.
Everyone is going to be so happy you're back. And I'm sorry, too.
She replied, her ears falling back.
Sorry, for what?
Gunnar asked, missing the cue her ears announced loudly. Charlie suddenly grabbed for Julie. He knew what was coming when he saw her ears go back. Just as Charlie grabbed her from behind, she slammed her knee into Gunnar's groin. She began yelling and screaming at him.
Where the hell have you been?
She struggled to loose herself from Charlie's hold.
Do you have any idea what's happened here?
She swung her fist and kicked at Gunnar as best she could.
7 damned years!
Mixed tears of happiness, fear, and frustration. Relief streamed from her face as she continued to berate him, her face turning bright red. Karen had come to Gunnar's aid, but had mixed feelings about healing his injury in its awkward location. Gunnar lay on the ground, curled in a ball, pale and groaning as the urge to vomit increased. The king, triumphant in his battle, had returned home. There were some requests to pass on some messages from some of the people who auditioned. Talon Acura on May 27th, 2021. Hi there. I created an account on Casting Call Club just to audition for your project. I'm brand new to the industry, and I will absolutely send through an audition as soon as I'm able, but regardless of that, I wanted to tell you that this project is truly touching, and I hope it brings you and your dad more happiness than you hope. MJ. Director Melody on May 28th, 2021. Oh my gosh, I just came across the casting call and I just want to say I really hope your dad gets better. I can't imagine what you're going through right now. I'm sure he'll love hearing the book and it'll come out amazing. Stay strong.
Hi, Bruce. Obviously we don't know each other, and the only connection really is working with your son on this project. But I just wanted to say that I am very thankful to have the opportunity to tell this story with your son. I'm really glad that he was able to put as much of this together as he could. I want you to know that I will be praying for you. I will be praying for your family, and I wish all of you the best. Take care of yourself, and I hope you enjoy the story.
Some facts about the project. The chapter, as it's written, when this was put together, stood at a modest 5,258 words. Without the title included, it is 5,242 words. 4,945 are spoken by me as the narrator, and that is based off of the 313 words spoken by the wonderful voices you heard here today. Mitch actually played 3 characters, technically. He voiced the guy who got shot in the eye with an arrow. It's what we call an NPC, non-player character. While trying to decide what to get you for Father's Day, I remembered you had expressed interest in hearing my story. I had hoped to have something almost complete, maybe a second draft or something, but that's not the case. So I thought maybe I could send you a PDF to read. Thinking about it and, eyesight, I realized it's probably not the best idea, so why not read it for you? You had also commented how you miss hearing my voice. So what better way to give you both things at once? This project was listed on May 9th, 2021. Auditions ran for 22 days and were halted on June 1st. In total, there were 469 submitted auditions. Of those 469 auditions, 267 were unique voice actors. 24 auditions were withdrawn, and during the review process, I had shortlisted 51.
Of those shortlists, 4 actors went on to be cast, resulting in a grand total of 441 rejections that I listened to individually and judged. I had to listen to them over and over again to make sure I was hearing what I thought I was. It's a lot more work than I thought it was going to be. 272 people decided to follow the project. So to put those numbers into context, 100% was 469 auditions. The unique actors, 267, made up 57% of all auditions. The followers, probably a mixture of people who are auditioned and just wanting to follow along to see how things turn out, those 272 made up 58% of the 469. The rejections, 441, 94.03% of all auditions. Shortlists, the 51, was 10.87%. Withdrawn, the 24, made up 5.12% of the 469. And the 4 people that it came down to only made up 0.85% of all auditions for this project. So I thought you might find that interesting. So just trying to think of some things to add in here that you might have questions about. So, but yeah, so I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, and you've got the link so you can listen to it as many times as you want. You can skip around on it, do what you need to analyze it. And if you have any questions or suggestions, of course, you can contact me. So anyways, Dad, I love you, and thank you for listening.